This little boy was tortured for months. When he finally died, his parents fed his small, lifeless body to the pigs because the smell of his rotting corpse was becoming too much. His name was Adrian Jones. He was just 7 years old. I'm warning you now, this story is one of the most disturbing child abuse cases ever recorded. Adrian spent his final days in a house of horror, strapped to a table, blindfolded, starving. He was locked in a shower stall for weeks. Some nights, they forced him to stand neck-deep in a freezing, filthy, bug-infested pool, alone in the dark. And the most heartbreaking part? At just 5 years old, Adrian told Child Protective Services that his father kicked him in the back of the head. He cried out for help, and no one came. By the time someone finally listened, Adrian was already gone. Adrian Alexander Jones was born on May 18, 2008 in Missouri. He came into the world like any other child, wide-eyed, innocent, and full of possibility. He had soft blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. In photos, he looked like a happy little boy, the kind you'd see playing in a park or laughing at cartoons on a Saturday morning. But the truth was, Adrian never really had a stable home. His biological parents, Michael Jones and Dana Pierce, separated early in his life. He spent time bouncing between homes, passed around like a problem no one wanted to deal with. When he was just a toddler, reports of neglect already began to surface. People noticed things that didn't sit right. He showed up with bruises. He looked thin. He acted scared. At one point, his grandmother took custody of him. She loved him, and for a little while, Adrian seemed to be okay. He had siblings, cousins, and people who gave him some version of a normal life. He played, he laughed, he drew pictures. Teachers remembered him as quiet but polite, a little shy, maybe too shy, but he followed the rules and he tried to do his best. But Adrian's time in safety was short-lived. Eventually, custody was returned to his father, Michael, who was now living with his new wife, Heather Jones. That's when the light in Adrian's eyes started to fade. From the outside, it looked like they were a blended family. Adrian had 6 siblings, and they all lived together in a rental home in Kansas City, Kansas. But behind closed doors, something was deeply wrong. Neighbors rarely saw the children playing outside. The shades were always pulled down. And Adrian, once full of energy, started to vanish from public view. Even then, small signs were there. School staff raised concerns. Adrian had once told a teacher that he was being hit. There were reports, there were visits, but somehow he kept getting sent back to the very people who were hurting him. And the worst part? Adrian still had hope. He still believed someone would help him. He drew pictures of himself as a police officer, saving people. He told caseworkers he wanted to be good. He wanted to make his dad proud. He wanted to stop getting in trouble. He was just a little boy, craving love, trying to understand a world that had already turned its back on him. And no one, not the family court, not child protection, not the adults around him, gave him a real chance. Adrian's early life wasn't full of joy and safety. It was full of warning signs, and everyone missed them. At first, the abuse crept in quietly, like a shadow stretching across Adrian's small world. Once he was back in his father's home, the warmth he'd known with his grandmother was gone. Michael Jones wasn't a gentle parent. He was angry, paranoid, and cold. And Heather, his stepmother, was even worse. She didn't see Adrian as a child. She saw him as a burden, something to be controlled, broken, silenced. The punishments started small. Extra chores, early bedtimes, food taken away if he didn't obey. But then it got worse, and fast. Adrian was labeled bad by the very people responsible for loving him. If he wet the bed, he was screamed at. If he didn't answer fast enough, he was hit. Every small mistake turned into a reason to punish, and the punishments began to feel less like discipline and more like cruelty. There were signs. So many signs. Adrian's body began to show the truth. Bruises on his face, marks on his arms. One report mentioned a black eye. Another described him as having hollow cheeks, like he wasn't eating enough. He became quieter, jumpy. He flinched when adults got too close. He stopped smiling in photos. And yet, every time someone asked questions, Michael and Heather had an answer. He's just clumsy. He lies for attention. He bruises easily. He acts out. He's hard to control. It worked. Authorities backed off. One caseworker came to the house and noted that Adrian looked thin but okay. Another said the home was messy but livable. Over and over again, Adrian was interviewed, only to be left behind in the same place where the pain was growing. The turning point came when Heather began documenting the abuse herself through disturbing surveillance videos and text messages. She recorded Adrian's every move using night vision cameras placed inside the home. She bragged about the punishments, laughed at his pain. One text to Michael read, "He's been standing in the corner for over 9 hours. He's still crying." They stopped treating him like a child altogether. He was being watched, punished, starved, not because he was dangerous, but because they could, because no one stopped them. And the more they got away with, the more brutal they became. Meanwhile, Adrian was slowly disappearing from school, from society, from life itself. Eventually, he was pulled from public school altogether. Michael and Heather claimed they'd homeschool him. That was the last time anyone outside the family saw Adrian alive. He had been isolated, cut off, erased. The red flags were screaming, but no one, no teacher, no social worker, no court followed them to the truth. And so, the real nightmare was only just beginning. Once Adrian vanished from school, he vanished from the world. There were no more teachers checking in, no more lunches to fill his stomach, no more watchful eyes to ask questions. Inside that house, far from help, Adrian Jones was being destroyed, slowly, day by day, by the very people who were supposed to love him. Michael and Heather Jones didn't just hurt Adrian, they tortured him. They locked him in a cold, filthy shower stall for weeks at a time. He was not allowed out. There was no bed, no toilet, no food, just a dark corner of the house where a 7-year-old was left to rot. His skin began to break down. His body grew weaker. And still, they ignored his pain. They starved him to the point where he peeled the skin off his body and tried to eat it, desperate for anything to survive. Adrian was so hungry, so broken, that his instinct to live turned inward. His body was eating itself. He was tased regularly, electrocuted like a criminal. A taser pressed to his bare skin, held there for up to 20 seconds at a time. He screamed, he cried, and then, eventually, he stopped reacting at all, as if his body had accepted the pain as normal. Michael, his own father, beat him so often and so violently that Adrian's bones began to show. His body was covered in open sores, bruises, and wounds that never healed. The abuse was relentless. Some days, he was forced to stand in place for hours, punished if he moved even an inch. Other days, he was blindfolded, restrained, and left to suffer in silence. At night, they sometimes dragged him into the backyard, forcing him to stand neck-deep in a freezing, bug-infested swimming pool. He was completely alone. The water was filthy, the air was cold, and Adrian was just a little boy, trembling in the dark. He was no longer allowed to eat with the family, no longer allowed to sleep in a bed, no longer spoken to with kindness. Adrian was isolated, ignored, and tortured into silence. He began to break mentally. He talked to himself, whispered into the air, saw things that weren't there. His mind was collapsing under the weight of what was being done to him. He had cried out for help before, even told child services that his father kicked him in the head. But those warnings had been brushed aside. Every time someone had a chance to save him, they looked away. The children in the house witnessed it all. Some were too scared to speak. Some tried to sneak him food. But they were just kids, terrified of becoming the next target. So the abuse went on, uninterrupted. By the time Adrian died, he weighed only 61 pounds. His body was covered in injuries, some old, some new. His eyes were empty, his spirit gone. He wasn't treated like a child. He wasn't even treated like a human. He was broken, erased, and thrown away by the very people who brought him into this world. And the people who could have stopped it? They were too late, or rather, they failed in their duty. Adrian Jones was already dead before anyone realized he was missing. When police first came to the Jones home in November 2015, it had nothing to do with Adrian. Heather had called 911 to report a domestic disturbance. She claimed Michael had threatened her with a gun. Officers responded, expecting a routine check on a violent argument. What they walked into was far from routine. The house was filthy, trash everywhere, rotting food, insects crawling across the floors, feces smeared on the walls. The smell was overwhelming. 6 children were found inside, all pale, thin, and quiet. But one child was missing: Adrian. He wasn't in the house, not with the other kids, not in any room, not even mentioned until officers started asking questions. "Where's Adrian?" That's when Heather cracked. She told officers he wasn't around anymore, that he'd died weeks earlier, that his body had been disposed of. And just like that, the horror began to unfold. Police secured the property and returned the next day with a full investigation team. That's when they found it. Out behind the house, in a barn, they located the pigsty. Inside were bone fragments, scraps of clothing, and small human remains. What was left of Adrian had been fed to the pigs. Forensic testing later confirmed the truth. The bones belonged to Adrian Jones, a 7-year-old boy who had never been reported missing. Even the most hardened investigators were shaken. But the most disturbing discovery was still inside the house. A full network of surveillance cameras had been set up by Heather and Michael, not for security, but to monitor and control Adrian. Footage from those cameras captured the sickening truth in chilling detail. There was no guessing, no gaps in the story. Everything had been recorded. Adrian was seen being beaten, electrocuted with a stun gun, starved, and stripped naked before being locked in a small, cold shower stall. For days, then weeks. He could be seen curled up on the floor, shaking, wasting away. In other clips, he stood in place for hours, too afraid to move. This was more than abuse. It was calculated torture. Detectives sat through hours of video that documented Adrian's slow decline, his body shrinking, his eyes fading, his hope disappearing. One officer later said it was the worst thing he had ever witnessed, not just because of the violence, but because it was done so methodically, so deliberately, and no one had stopped it. Even more haunting was the silence outside those walls. There had been no calls to police, no missing child report, no alarm raised by the community. Adrian had vanished without a sound. And if not for that domestic violence call, his story might have ended in complete silence. Michael and Heather were both arrested. The evidence was overwhelming. Between the bone fragments, the video footage, and the visible injuries on Adrian's malnourished body, there was no denying what had happened. He had been tortured and murdered by the people meant to protect him, and left to rot in the mud among pigs. What struck investigators most was the complete failure of every system around Adrian: schools, social workers, and the courts. He had told people he was being hurt, he had begged for help, and still he was left to die behind closed doors. Adrian wasn't just a victim of his parents. He was a victim of a world that failed to listen. The truth about what happened to Adrian Jones shook the whole of Kansas. Once the footage was uncovered, once the bones were found, once the world saw what had been done to that little boy, there was no escaping justice. The public was outraged. People cried. People demanded answers. How could this happen? How could no one stop it? In 2017, Michael Jones pled guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion, no apology, just sat in silence as the court declared what everyone already knew, that he had taken the life of his own son in the most inhuman way imaginable. Heather Jones, his wife and Adrian's stepmother, was sentenced to life as well. She also pled guilty. She claimed to be a victim of abuse herself, but the court didn't buy it. The videos showed her role, her cruelty, her cold indifference as Adrian wasted away right in front of her. There was no forgiveness for either of them. But sentencing 2 monsters to life behind bars didn't bring Adrian back. It didn't undo the years of pain he suffered, and it didn't erase the fact that he cried out for help again and again, and no one listened. Child Protective Services had been involved with Adrian's family for years. He'd been removed from the home once before. He told social workers about the abuse. Teachers had raised concerns. But every time, the system sent him back into the arms of the very people who would kill him. His case became a symbol of failure. After his death, lawmakers in Kansas and Missouri pushed for stronger child protection laws. People demanded more oversight, more accountability. But even with those changes, the haunting question remains. How many other Adrians are out there, suffering in silence, while the world looks the other way? Adrian's story isn't just another tragedy. It's a warning. It reminds us what can happen when we ignore the signs, when we believe excuses, when we trust broken systems to protect the most vulnerable. Adrian was a little boy, full of life, love, and hope. He deserved birthday parties, hugs, and bedtime stories. Instead, he got a cage, starvation, and silence. That's why we can't forget him. That's why his name still matters. Because Adrian didn't just die from abuse. He died from being unseen, unheard, and unloved in the very moments he needed help the most. Let his story change something. Let it open your eyes. Let it remind you to speak up, to care, and to never stay silent when a child is in danger. And if you believe these stories matter, if you believe children like Adrian deserve to be remembered, and that we must hold abusers accountable, then please subscribe to my channel. Because telling these stories might just save a life.